The Denver Nuggets are one of the more interesting stories in the NBA over the last 5 to 6 years. This is an organization that at one point was led by one of the better players in the NBA with Carmelo Anthony, was forced to trade him away, but somehow got better, but then ruined it all within one offseason, and then just 5 short years later, not only find themselves at the top of the conference, but also has one of the best young cores the NBA has to offer, and the future is looking mighty bright. But what makes it so interesting is how the Nuggets were able to do this. Because out of all of the young players that are on the roster right now, none of them were originally selected by a Denver Nuggets draft pick, except for Jokic, and he was a second rounder. So how exactly were the Denver Nuggets able to pull off one of the more improbable rebuilds that we have seen? Now, in an act to not make this video too long, our story is going to begin in the summer of 2013. However, I'm going to give you a quick backstory of what exactly happened that led us up to this moment. Masai Ujiri has been the general manager for the Denver Nuggets over the past 2 seasons. He first started off in the 2011 season, in which he was dealt with the Carmelo Anthony problem, eventually trading him to the New York Knicks, and in return finessing them and receiving a whole bunch of players as well as 2 first-rounders from the Knicks themselves, which to this day blows me away. They finish out the season relatively respectable with a 50-win season, however, still gets knocked out in the first round by the Oklahoma City Thunder. By the next year, they went into the offseason, got involved with the Andrew Bynum, Dwight Howard transaction, and in return, they received Andre Iguodala. Entering the 2012-2013 season with some level of optimism, but no one expected the Denver Nuggets to finish the year off with 57 wins. Because the organization overachieved so greatly, Masai Ujiri received Executive of the Year and George Karl received Coach of the Year. However, in one offseason, not only did they lose Masai Ujiri, but they also fired George Karl in one of the more questionable decisions that I've ever seen in my entire life, and there was a lot of questions that needed to be answered by a general manager, and unfortunately, the young, inexperienced Tim Connolly was the one who was going to have to answer them. Which thus brings us to June 17th, 2013, where Tim Connolly was named not only the VP of Basketball Operations, but the general manager for the Denver Nuggets as well. And unfortunately, the young and inexperienced GM had a lot on his plate. For starters, he obviously had to find a head coach. They decided to go with Brian Shaw, who was very questionable at best, largely due to his inexperience. And also, his coaching style really contradicted with some of the personnel that was already on the team. The second thing that Tim Connolly had to address was Andre Iguodala and his contract situation, as Iggy was on an expiring contract, and unfortunately, they got to a point where Iggy and the Nuggets could not get on the same page on how he was going to be compensated, so they decided to just sign and trade him to the Golden State Warriors. And unfortunately, and I largely blame the inexperience of Tim Connolly at the time, the Denver Nuggets only received Randy Foye in return. And oh yes, just to add insult to injury, in the 2013 draft, the Denver Nuggets selected Rudy Gobert, but then traded him to the Utah Jazz and in return received Eric Green and some cash. So yeah, the 2013 offseason was pretty rough for the Nuggets. And due to the questionable decisions, especially the loss of Andre Iguodala, the Denver Nuggets finished the 2013-2014 season with only 36 wins. But luckily, almost everything would change in nearly one offseason. Because now fast forward to the 2014 draft, the Denver Nuggets made some pretty significant moves, even if they didn't know it at the time. With the 11th overall pick, the Nuggets selected Doug Mcdermott, who was a 6'8" sharp-shooting forward, but immediately traded him to the Chicago Bulls. In return, they received Gary Harris, Yusuf Nurkic, and a second-round pick. Which, looking back at it now, I'm pretty sure we can all confidently claim the Denver Nuggets came out on top in that transaction. But the Denver Nuggets were not done yet. Later on in that same draft class, the Denver Nuggets, with a second-round pick, drafted Nikola Jokic, a 7-footer out of Serbia who offensively was extremely talented, a really good passer for his position, however had some major questions about his mobility, conditioning, and what exactly he was bringing to the table on the defensive end. And oh yeah, let me not forget, due to prior obligations, it was going to take at least 1 year before Jokic was going to be able to make his appearance in the NBA. But looking back at it now with hindsight, drafting Jokic with a second-round pick pick is just amazing, especially since he turned out to be a franchise caliber player. And also the Nuggets drafted Devin Marbles in the second round as well, but they utilized him in a transaction with Evan Fournier to trade both of them to the Orlando Magic, and in return they received Aaron Aflalo. But even with all those acquisitions, heading into the 2014-2015 season, expectations and the optimism of the fan base and the organization really didn't rise that much, especially because a lot of those pieces were going to be projects and didn't pan out until several years down the line. The Nuggets started off with an extremely slow start in the beginning of the season, and by the All-Star break they had a record of 20-33. So obviously, like any general manager would do in a rebuild situation, Tim Connolly started to just trade away as many assets as possible and started to free some cap. The Nuggets traded Timothy Mozgov to the Cleveland Cavaliers and in return received some draft picks, traded JaVale McGee and his horrible contract to the Philadelphia 76ers for some random guy and some cash, traded Nate Robinson to the Boston Celtics for Jameer Nelson, and the most noteworthy transaction is when they traded Aaron Aflalo and Alonzo G to the Portland Trail Blazers and in return received Will Barton, Victor Claver, Thomas Robinson, and a 2016 first round pick, which worked out pretty well for the Denver Nuggets, especially when you take into consideration that Will Barton is now a consistent 13 to 16 point scorer, and they got a draft pick out of it as well. Now fast forward to March 3rd, 2015, and the Nuggets decided to fire Brian Shaw and go in a different direction as they ended the season with only 30 wins. And now in the 2015 offseason, they decide to stay on track, rebuild, and trade away as many assets as they possibly can. They hired Mike Malone as a head coach, drafted Emmanuel Mudiay with the 7th overall pick in the 2015 draft, traded Ty Lawson to the Houston Rockets for some miscellaneous pieces and a first round pick, and finally they officially signed Nikola Jokic to the team as he was able to make his season debut in the NBA. Now in the 2015-2016 season, and a consistent theme started to reoccur. The team was still inexperienced, the team was still young, and they really didn't have any marquee players, so the Denver Nuggets were still losing. By the All-Star break, they had a record of 22-32, and again decided to start trading away some of their pieces. By the end of the 2016 season, the Denver Nuggets would finish with a record of 33-49, an improvement from last year, but not a noticeable one. But luckily for the Denver Nuggets, all of the trades and finessing that they had been doing over the past several years now put them in a situation to have 3 first-round picks in the 2016 draft class. Their first round pick originally belonged to the New York Knicks, however they received it during the Carmelo Anthony trade, and they decided to select Jamal Murray with the 7th overall pick. Their second first round pick originally belonged to the Houston Rockets, in which they received it through the Ty Lawson transaction, and with the 15th overall pick they decided to go with Juan Hernangomez. And then finally with the 19th overall pick, which originally belonged to the Portland Trail Blazers, but they received it during the Aaron Aflalo and Alonzo G transaction, they decided to go with Malik Beasley. Now looking back at it now, we clearly know that's a pretty good haul, especially since Jamal Murray turned out to be a consistent 15-point scorer on rather impressive shooting splits for his age. But more importantly, the fact that all 3 of those players turned out to be productive pieces for this team moving forward, and none of them were originally the Denver Nuggets draft pick, is mighty impressive. And before we head into the next season, I have to mention this. The Denver Nuggets decided to trade Joffrey Laverne to the Oklahoma City Thunder, and in return they receive 2 second-rounders. Normally that wouldn't mean much, but one of those second-rounders turned out to be a somewhat productive player for this team, so obviously I had to bring it up. But now heading into the 2016-2017 season, and the Denver Nuggets had a huge question mark on what exactly their expectations were. Granted, some of the younger players have been on the team for a little bit longer now, and Danilo Gallinari started to be more of a consistent scoring threat, but to be completely honest, you really and truly didn't know what you're going to get from some of these younger players, especially since Emmanuel Mudiay's rookie season wasn't that good at all, and Jokic, granted, was drafted 2 years ago, but he only concluded his first year in the NBA. But luckily for the Nuggets, this is the year where Jokic famously took off. See, in the beginning of the season, the Denver Nuggets were starting Jusuf Nurkic, and he was an okay starter, but they found themselves playing Nurkic and Jokic on the court at the same time, which in theory might have worked in the 90s, but in the 2010s doesn't really work out that well. And eventually became obvious that this really wasn't going to work out, and a decision needed to be made sooner than later. So Jokic took it upon himself to make sure that decision was as easy as possible. The night is December 12th, 2016, and the Denver Nuggets are matching up with the Dallas Mavericks. Nurkic is a starter, and he ended the night recording only 4 points, 6 rebounds, 2 assists, but turned the ball over 3 times and shot 2 for 6 from the field. Jokic, on the other hand, who came off the bench, ended that night recording 27 points, 11 rebounds, 4 assists, while shooting 83% from the field and a perfect 7 for 7 from the free throw line. So yeah, Jokic made it pretty obvious who's going to be the starter moving forward. And from that moment on, Jokic was a starter. And for the next 25 games, Jokic would continue to impress. Within that 25 game stretch, Jokic would average 21 points, nearly 10 rebounds, 5 assists on ridiculous shooting splits. And so with it being obvious who is going to be their starting center moving forward, Jusuf Nurkic was eventually traded to the Portland Trail Blazers, and in return the Denver Nuggets received Mason Plumlee and a 2nd round pick. The Denver Nuggets finished the 2017 season with a record of 40-42, and even though yes it is a losing record, it was still a much needed improvement. And luckily for them, since Jokic started to take off, they now found their franchise player. Now I already know some Denver Nuggets fans don't want me to talk about this, but I have to since it's part of the whole process. With a 13th overall pick in the 2017 draft, they decided to select Donovan Mitchell, but turned around and traded him to the Utah Jazz and received Trey Lyles, which really hasn't worked out for them whatsoever, but I guess you can say it was in good favor, largely because both Gary Harris and Jamal Murray have panned out to be somewhat productive players, so I guess we'll give them a pass. But what's more noteworthy is who they selected in the 2nd round. Because with a 2nd round pick that originally belonged to the Oklahoma City Thunder, however they received through the Joffrey Laverne transaction, they selected Monte Morris. Monte Morris at the time obviously was a project since he was a 2nd round pick, but quickly he's actually turned out to be one of the more consistent scoring threats coming off the bench for them, especially this season. And since the Denver Nuggets finally had an identity and a franchise player in Jokic, they decided to move in a different direction. They eventually traded away Danilo Gallinari to the Los Angeles Clippers. They signed Paul Millsap, who came across as a really good partner for Jokic in the front court, especially with his ability to space out the floor and also be some type of defensive presence in which this team desperately needed. And then eventually in the regular season, they decided to just cut ties with Emmanuel Mudiay, trade him to the New York Knicks, and go forward with both Gary Harris and Jamal Murray as their starting backcourt mates. Now, unfortunately, as I got a little bit ahead of myself, early on in the 2017-2018 season, Paul Millsap did suffer an injury, which kind of kept them back defensively, and many people point to that injury specifically, in which kept them out of the playoffs, as by the end of the season, they finished with a record of 46-36, which was literally just 1 game removed from making the playoffs. And who knows, if Paul Millsap was there, they possibly would have made the playoffs, but defensively, they definitely would have looked better than they did throughout the entire season. However, I actually believe it worked out for them because both Jokic and their young backcourt improved significantly within that season as their responsibility continued to grow and the burden was put on their shoulders, and they showed up numerous times throughout the 2017-2018 season. And this team was able to piece together one of the more impressive runs post All-Star break in the NBA. Which finally brings us to this season. The Denver Nuggets thoroughly committed to their new young core, so they decided to get rid of Wilson Chandler and finally decided to ship off Kenneth Faried. Paul Millsap has come back and played a full season, or as many games as you would expect someone his age to play, and so far this year they have been amazing. And I think a lot of people tend to forget that they actually drafted Michael Porter Jr., and that could potentially be a problem moving forward, but just this year alone, they have been one of the more impressive teams in the NBA and one of the biggest surprises in the league as well. Jokic's numbers are remarkable, and his ability to pass has finally been on full display for everybody to marvel at. Both Gary Harris and Jamal Murray have continued to develop, and Gary Harris is actually a pretty solid defender. I know a lot of Denver Nuggets fans were upset at me for saying that he was a suspect defender early on in the regular season, so please forgive me. He's actually a pretty solid defender, and some of those miscellaneous pieces that they picked up along the way, such as Monte Morris, Malik Beasley, Torrey Craig, and Mason Plumlee, are pretty productive players so far this season. And if Will Barton was healthy the entire season, I might have been able to say pretty confidently that this was going to be the best bench in the NBA. But nevertheless, as I record this, the Denver Nuggets have a record of 49-23, and they find themselves at the top of the conference. Jokic, even though many people don't want to talk about it, in my opinion, he is an MVP candidate. I don't think he's going to win it, but it should be noted that he is having, again, a remarkable season. The Nuggets are one of the few teams that are both top 10 in offense and defense, and even though offensively many people expected this team to be great because they've been rather consistent on that side of the ball over the last 2 years, defensively is where we've seen a significant jump. And even though he doesn't get enough credit, I do believe Mike Malone should be in the conversation for Coach of the Year. And again, what makes everything so interesting about this team is how they rebuild. This is an organization that had 2 top draft picks, traded both of them away, and almost every single last player on this team was selected by another organization's draft pick, except for Jokic, and he was a second rounder. So yet again, this is another great example of how you can rebuild an organization without just tanking. And with that being said, people, please let me know what you think about the video in the comment section below. Let me know what you think about the Denver Nuggets and how underrated they are, because they're definitely one of the more underrated teams in the NBA. And with that being said, I'll see you all next time. Peace.